we recrossed the Delaware, prizing Colonel Rahl and his Hessians at Trenton. I tell you, my favorite view of Trenton is down the barrel of a cannon. Now, a few days later, General Lord Cornwallis, commander of the British Army at that time, tried to trap us in Trenton, but we slipped away. General Washington had to slip away. We countermarched, and we took them at Princeton instead. I don't suppose any of you would know this, but before the war, I had applied to the College of New Jersey at Princeton and been denied. Well, as the 55th and 40th Regiments of Foot fell back on Nassau Hall, I got into the College of New Jersey at Princeton with cannon. If some of you young ones here are to apply to university, you perhaps ought to use pen and paper. Cannon only worked for myself, and then of course they closed the school shortly thereafter. Now, in the aftermath of the battles of Trenton and Princeton, His Excellency General Washington did me the honor of asking me to become one of his aides-de-camp. And an aide-de-camp is really a military secretary, if you will. The duties include the interrogation of prisoners, the interrogation of spies, very infrequently acting in the general's name. But more often than not, it is the day-to-day administration of the army. And when General Washington brought me on his staff, it became my job to help him feed and clothe the army. And it was difficult to do so. When you start a war, and the precept of the war is you do not want to pay taxes, how do you feed and clothe an army? Well, you don't. Now, it's a misrepresentation for me to say we didn't want to pay taxes. No taxation without representation, as James Otis would have it. Odd little man that he is. But what it meant in effect is that people weren't paying their taxes. In the retreat through New Jersey, it was my custom at that time to walk alongside the cannon. And I would pat the cannon as I would walk along, absorbed in thought. And I couldn't help but notice the tracks in front of me, the wagon wheels, the hoof prints of the horses, and the footprints of the men. Very often shod, but very often, like as not, unshod. You know, cold goes through leather like that. And once leather becomes permeated due to inclement weather, upon drying it becomes very brittle and it starts to crack open. The men would try to tie the shoes on their feet with rags and scraps, but ultimately that would fall away. And we would be looking at bare footprints in the snow and the muck and the mire. And then, of course, because skin itself is nothing more than leather, that too would begin to open up. And we would be looking at bloody footprints in the snow and the muck and the mire, and we saw it all throughout the war. We saw it on the retreat through New Jersey, we saw it at Morristown, we saw it at Valley Forge. I began to ask myself, why have we come to such desperate straits? Why is there no proper sustenance for our troops? Men give me credit for some genius. All the genius I have lies in this. When I have a subject in hand, my mind becomes pervaded by it. Day and night it is before me. I plumb the problem to its very depths, then the results of my reflection, some men are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It is not. It is the fruit of labor and thought. And what was the source of our trouble at the time? Why could we not provide for our troops? It was the government we had. Now, what was the government that we had at the time during the war? Yes. We had a monarchy prior to the war, but once we established our independence and the Declaration of Independence, thank you, Mr. Jefferson, we had a different government. Yes? Well, it was an attempt at a Republican government. I'll give you a hint. It starts with an A. Yes? Stand up. Say that again.
Articles of Confederation.
The Articles of Confederation. Now, what were some of the troubles with the Articles of Confederation? Some of you teachers must remember what it was like. It was just a legislature. There was no executive branch. There was no president. There was no judiciary. There was no unified currency. Every single state, and sometimes subdivisions of states, had their own currency. You couldn't spend New Jersey money in Pennsylvania or Pennsylvania money in New Jersey, even though they're just across the river. It was a legislature that could not even collect its own taxes. Taxes in those days were all collected by the individual states and then passed on to the federal government. Well, I suppose you know how that worked, yes? The states would collect the taxes, they would take what they needed, and before passing it on to the federal government, they'd look about and say, oh, there's a bridge that needs mending over here, streets need recobbling, By the time the states had done with it, there was rarely anything left to pass on to the federal government. It worked so poorly that in 1787 we had to meet to form a new government. Now, we went to Philadelphia to do that. Well, Dr. Franklin came to the convention in Philadelphia, and Dr. Franklin and General Washington, and a good thing too, because they lent an authority to the convention in Philadelphia. You see, well, we weren't actually sent to Philadelphia to create a new government, but only to amend the Articles of Confederation. Can I have a volunteer to be Mr. Madison? Yes. Yeah, come on up. Very good. Step right this way. Very good. Step down here. Very good. What's your name?
Yeah, Darnell.
Darnell. Everyone say hello, Darnell. Good day, Mr. Madison.
Good day, Mrs. Madison.
Mr. Madison was an important individual. And at that time, Mr. Madison and I saw eye to eye. Literally, he's just a bit shorter than I am. And Mr. Madison and I knew we could no longer operate under the Articles of Confederation. And we enjoined all of our friends, all of our important people to send delegates to Philadelphia, where we would supposedly amend the Articles of Confederation. Is that right? That's right, yes. That's what we were to do. But it wasn't but a few weeks later that Mr. Madison stood forth and presented, do you know what he was presented? It was a plan. The Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan. Mr. Madison stood up as bold as brass at all his 5'6" and presented an entirely new form of government. Sending a word to the delegates at the convention, we were talking about something completely different, about creating a new government. Yes? Right. Now, Jemmy, we called him Jemmy. Jemmy and I agreed that we needed this new government. We could no longer operate under the Articles of Confederation. What was the chief tenet of your plan, your Virginia plan? Can you read that?
All the states should get representation based on population.
All the states should get representation based on population. Let's give Mr. Madison a round of applause. Thank you, Mr. Madison. But of course, it's not so simple, right? The small states thought they were going to be overpowered by the larger states. If all the representation is based entirely on population, well, the small states thought they would be overpowered. So Mr. Patterson of New Jersey put forward his New Jersey plan, which was just a rehashing of the Articles of Confederation. It isn't until Roger Sherman comes up with the compromise, where we have House of Representation has representation based on population, and in the Senate, we get 2 senators each. Now, I'm very often asked my opinion of the Constitution. I will tell you, I never expect to see perfect work from imperfect man. And there wasn't a man jack of us who was completely satisfied with the document when we left that September day of 1787, but we all felt we had something we could work with. Now, of course, nobody knew what that was. We had all sworn an oath of secrecy, not from some nefarious purpose, as Jefferson might imply, but from an honest hope that we would have a freedom of expression of ideas. For if we knew that upon saying them, they would be taken to the newspapers and spread to the public at large, there would be great fears in bringing our ideas forward. And we are the great experiment. We need all the great ideas we can get. But it chiefly meant people didn't know what kind of government we had created. A woman accosted Dr. Franklin on the street and said, "Dr. Franklin, what sort of government have you given us?" And Dr. Franklin said, "A republic, if you can keep it." So thus we had a new government. Not quite, still had to be ratified, that's another story.